His life ended in a hail of bullets.
He shot 3 times.
Any sign of the shooter?
No. Wait a minute.
The 911 caller saw someone over the body going through his pockets.
The person looked like they were robbing him.
When police begin their investigation, they locate more than one possible suspect.
What they find out is on the video, there were 4 people.
But was the shooting simply a random attack? Or was this a targeted killing?
We find out later they kind of knew each other.
Richard, your brother?
It seems like they were connected with one another.
And when police finally unravel the connection, it exposes the jealous truth.
She kept her relationship a secret.
They dated years ago, it was over, and it was done.
He was not just jealous, but potentially violent.
He was out for revenge.
November 21st, 2012. It's the day before Thanksgiving in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the state's biggest city.
There's a lot of anticipation in the air. It's a time where most people in Minneapolis are spending time with their family and getting ready for Christmas.
But one Minneapolis man won't be home for the holidays.
Just a little bit before midnight, there was a 911 call that someone had been shot.
911. Do you need police, fire, or medical?
Yeah, I think I just heard gunshots.
He said, I'm looking out my window and I see a man on the ground who's been shot.
Any sign of the shooter?
No. Wait a minute.
Still on the phone with 911, the caller sees someone approach the man on the ground.
He sees this person rifling through his pockets.
He tells the person on the phone, I think he's the one who did it.
Do you see a gun?
No.
The 911 caller lowers his voice, almost as if he's fearful that this person could see him.
But then, to the caller's relief, the man flees.
Okay, all right, he's running away.
And by the time first responders arrive, he's nowhere to be found.
They did find a man on the ground.
There's no pulse.
He shot 3 times, and they pronounced him dead at the scene.
And whatever the other man was looking for, it wasn't his wallet.
They go through his pockets, they find his ID, and discover who it is.
Richard Jenkins.
30-year-old Richard Jenkins had grown up in Minneapolis.
Minnesota is an interesting place. Really, it's a very nice place to live.
About a quarter of the Black population in Minnesota lives in Minneapolis. So there's a vibrant Black community.
But for Richard, his hometown didn't always feel welcoming.
Richard was a person who was trying to find his way in the world.
He had a rough time. He was constantly looking for a job, and he didn't have stable housing.
As a result, he's relied on family and friends for a roof over his head.
Luckily for Richard, his friend David Dillon always had his back.
They're really close friends, so much so that they refer to one another as brothers.
Even though they're not biologically related, they are very, very close.
And when Richard needed a place to stay, David and his family opened their home to him.
Thank you.
Need anything else?
No, I'm good.
David allows him to move in with him and his girlfriend Kiki and her daughter. It's just made him, I think, more stable in his life.
And soon, Richard found someone to share it with, too.
He meets a woman named Letitia Williams. Letitia is this beautiful, smart woman, and they just kind of fall in love with one another.
For Letitia, Richard wasn't just a romantic partner. He was a potential father for her child.
She was single, basically raising her child by herself, and having someone there that not only appreciated and loved her, but her daughter meant a lot to her.
When you are a single mother and you're raising a child and you enter a relationship, you want for that person to embrace your child as if they were their own.
And that's exactly what Richard did.
He was crazy about Letitia's child. Didn't matter if somebody else was the father. He took that child in as his own.
Soon, Richard and Letitia were planning their future as a family.
They were talking about moving in together.
They were planning on building a life together.
And after years of struggle, it looked as if Richard had finally found happiness.
His life was looking up. It felt like he was moving in a positive direction.
He's starting to look forward to what can happen in the future.
Oh yeah, gunshot victim.
But now that future has been cut short with the discovery of Richard's bullet-riddled body.
He was lying on the ground near the I-94 sound wall.
Nope, no pulse.
The police pronounced Richard dead at the scene.
It's not major crimes.
Homicide detectives arrive minutes later and begin their investigation by speaking to the man who had called 911.
They didn't see the shooting, but they heard the gunshots.
When he looked out his window, he saw a man lying on the ground.
Dispatch said you saw the shooter?
I don't know. When I looked outside, there was a guy standing over the guy laying down.
He says he's going through the man's pockets.
It looks to me like he was trying to rob him.
Can you describe him?
They said it's a thin black man with a black hoodie and jeans on.
Presumably, this person is the shooter.
After struggling to find stability in his life, things were finally looking up for 30-year-old Richard Jenkins.
He has a really close friend named David who allows him to move in.
And Mr. Jenkins was also able to find love with a lady by the name of Letitia Williams.
Letitia is a wonderful young lady, passionate, very caring. What more could he ask for?
And she was every bit as thrilled as Richard.
She not only found a partner, but she found a father figure for her daughter.
They start imagining their future together.
But on the night before Thanksgiving, their dreams come crashing down.
Shortly before midnight, a man called 911, and he said, I just heard some gunshots.
And when police arrived, they found Richard dead on the ground near the interstate sound wall.
Richard was found shot several times.
And the man who had called 911 says he saw a man stoop down over Richard's body.
He saw the person rifling through Richard Jenkins's pockets.
Do you think he's the shooter?
He was the only guy out there.
He also noticed that man tried to get into a car that was nearby.
And he was trying to get in that car right over there.
He kept trying to open up all the doors, and he couldn't get in the car.
And then just ends up running off.
Did you see which way he ran?
He pointed towards this other building that was nearby. And he said, I think the person ran over that way, but I have no idea where he went after that.
He never got a good look at the man's face either.
He describes this person as being a thin, short, black male. He was wearing a black jacket and blue jeans. It's a relatively generic description, but that's all he had.
Okay. Thank you for your time, sir.
But will the crime scene be able to tell them anything more about the shooting?
Richard was lying on the grass near that sound wall.
Looking around the scene, the detectives find several shell casings.
Not far from the casings, the detectives also find a set of car keys.
And according to the 911 caller, the man who'd gone through Richard's pockets had also tried to get into a car that was parked nearby.
They go and see if the keys open that vehicle, and of course they do.
But when detectives run the car's plates,
Yeah, could you run this plate for me? 293 AAF.
it doesn't lead back to Richard.
Yeah, it's registered to a David Dillon.
Interesting.
Is David the shooter? Was David a witness? Was David involved?
And could he be the man spotted fleeing the scene?
Next, the detectives decided to follow the alley the suspect had fled down, and it led them to a high-rise housing project.
And they asked the front desk, have you seen this guy? And the person working the front desk says, I have seen someone who matches the description.
The security officer said he was pacing back and forth. He wasn't really making any sense.
He'd asked to use her phone to call 911 to report that he had just witnessed a murder.
Did you let him use the phone?
No.
The security guard was concerned about how erratic he appeared to be.
She didn't want him in the building and just asked him to leave.
I told him to leave.
And so he left.
Thank you for your time.
And it isn't long before the detectives learn where he'd gone.
Homicide.
The detectives received word that a man had been taken into custody after attempting to board a city bus.
He was talking to the driver and explaining that he needs help, he needs someone to call 911.
He said, I just witnessed a shooting.
Yeah, that sounds like our guy.
The bus driver had called 911, and when the police arrived, they took the man into custody.
He's incoherent, he's not making a lot of sense.
They took him to the hospital for an emergency psychiatric evaluation.
And it was only later that the officers learned he may be a person of interest in an active murder investigation.
Following up on the lead, the detectives head to the hospital, where they learn the man's name is David Dillon.
David is who the car is registered to.
You think maybe we could speak to him?
You can try. He's pretty out of it.
When David arrived at the hospital, the nurses describe him as really distraught.
Kept saying something about somebody shot his brother.
We're gonna go in and talk to him.
Thank you. They ended up having to sedate him to calm him down.
Despite that, the detectives attempt to question him.
You said you witnessed a murder.
I did. Richard.
David tells detectives that Richard was his best friend, like a brother to him.
He's saying, I can't believe I witnessed his death.
Why'd he do it?
Detectives asked David who was the shooter.
David.
But they don't get an answer.
He becomes incoherent.
He didn't have to do it.
At that point, the medication set in.
Before he's able to actually say the name, he passes out.
Come on, David.
Detectives investigating the fatal shooting that killed Richard Jenkins believe that they may have a first-hand witness, David Dillon.
David had been in hysterics, wandering the street ever since the shooting.
He is saying that his brother has been shot.
He had been so upset that police had taken him to the hospital for a psychiatric evaluation.
Which is where the detectives catch up with him.
Unfortunately, the nurses had just given him a sedative, so he is really not able to talk through what happened.
So do you know who killed Richard? David. Come on, David.
The sedative kicked in, and he was too groggy to speak.
With hours until the sedative wears off, detectives are left wondering what the extent of David's involvement could be.
Police have to decide, is this person a witness or was this person the perpetrator?
The witness who called 911 didn't see anybody but David at the crime scene.
Maybe the friends had an argument and David shot Richard in the heat of the moment.
Hoping for some clarity, the detectives turn to David's girlfriend, Kiki, who's just arrived at the hospital.
She has no idea what's happened.
And you also know Richard Jenkins?
Yeah, sure.
Kiki explains that Richard lived with her and David.
She says the two friends had gone out earlier that night.
And according to Kiki, Richard and David had gone out with two other men, Jermaine Harris and Lamar Dale.
They sometimes hung together, all four of them.
They'd been acquaintances for years.
But Kiki says that Richard and Jermaine recently had a falling out.
There was an ongoing beef between the two.
What kind of beef?
Kiki tells detectives that a few months prior, Jermaine learned that Richard was dating Letitia, who is his ex-girlfriend.
Jermaine had a fit over that. It's like, wait a minute, you're dating my ex? Are you serious?
And Letitia isn't just Jermaine's ex. She's the mother of his child.
Richard was very fond of this child, took the child in as his own. Jermaine couldn't handle that.
Maybe he didn't like Richard stepping in and trying to play daddy to his daughter.
I can see why Jermaine would be upset.
The thing is, Richard had no idea.
Letitia never told Richard that Jermaine was the father of her child or ex-boyfriend.
But eventually, Richard had learned the truth.
Jermaine and Lamar go to Richard's house and they confront him.
Richard was shocked because he didn't know.
For whatever reason, Jermaine was still really angry about it, even though they weren't together. And they began fighting.
They're throwing punches and slugging each other.
Thought they were gonna kill one another.
Lamar had to step in to break it up.
Kiki says Jermaine and Lamar left, but the feud continued.
Richard wasn't gonna take that lying down. So that night, he got some friends together, and they went out looking for Jermaine.
Richard and his friends found Jermaine, and it escalated to the point where somehow Jermaine ended up shot in the leg.
It's unclear who actually did the shooting.
But Kiki was determined to end the feud before someone ended up hurt even worse.
She called Jermaine and said, this has gotta stop. Somebody's gonna end up getting killed.
Eventually, the men had arranged a meeting to sit down and talk things out.
Jermaine apologized and promised not to go after Richard again.
And Richard said, "We're good. You can trust that I will leave it alone."
But now, detectives wonder if Jermaine kept his promise.
Looking to learn more about Jermaine, the detectives pull his criminal record.
They realized, yeah, he has had his run-ins with the police.
He has a laundry list of charges, some of them fleeing police, drugs, even impersonating other people.
However, when the detectives go looking for Jermaine, they find that the address in his file isn't current.
They subpoena the cell phone company to try to locate where Jermaine is.
Then, after filing the subpoena, detectives bring in Richard's girlfriend and Jermaine's ex, Letitia Williams, for questioning.
She is devastated by Richard's murder.
It's her partner, a person who has stepped in as a father figure for her daughter, and he's dead.
But despite her grief, she wants to help.
Do you know where we can find Jermaine?
No, I haven't even talked to him in weeks.
However, Letitia says she has recently spoken to David Dillon.
David called her right after the shooting happened.
He told me Jermaine did it.
Detectives investigating the murder of Richard Jenkins have just learned that his girlfriend, Letitia Williams, received a call from David Dillon just moments after the shooting.
David said, I know who shot him, and it was Jermaine.
Jermaine Harris is Letitia's ex-boyfriend and the father of her child.
Richard and Jermaine had no idea that they had Letitia in common. And so it was a bombshell when they found out.
It led to a falling out between Richard and Jermaine.
Well, you know how men can be.
She tells them they dated years ago, it was over, and they were no longer in any kind of relationship.
She's been raising the baby on her own.
And she never told Richard about her fling with Jermaine.
She knew that Jermaine could be a jealous guy.
But eventually, Jermaine found out, and his jealousy boiled over into a violent confrontation.
Jermaine had confronted Richard about his relationship with Letitia.
And then Jermaine ends up being shot in the leg.
After the last fight, they got together, had a conversation, tried to work it out.
I thought that was the end of it.
It was at that point Jermaine agreed to just let it go.
Or had he simply been biding his time?
So do you think Jermaine did it?
Honestly, I don't know.
You don't know.
She didn't know for sure, but she did know that that's what David told her.
Was it the truth? Or merely what David wanted her to think?
Letitia made it clear she had no idea of who shot who.
The detectives still haven't ruled out that David is the killer.
They haven't been able to talk to David yet because he's so messed up and medicated.
But at this point, he'd been released from the hospital, and detectives bring him in for a formal statement.
Sitting down with David, he still seems shocked by Richard's death.
David just can't believe that Richard is no longer here.
He tells them that Richard was like a brother to him.
And so Jermaine Harris, you knew him too?
Yeah.
He tells them he and Richard had hung with Lamar and Jermaine occasionally.
The four of them would just spend time partying, essentially.
But David says the party ended once Jermaine found out about Richard and Letitia.
I never seen Jermaine so mad.
But Letitia said you got that sorted out.
I guess, but it wasn't like things used to be.
David said Richard really did not trust Jermaine anymore and really didn't want to spend any more time with him.
That's why David says he was surprised when Jermaine and Lamar showed up at his house on the evening of the murder.
They wanted to hang out, you know, like clear the air.
And Richard was okay with that?
Yeah, he was like, why not?
Despite the past tension, they all decided to party together.
They just wanted to have a good time that night.
So they agreed to go to a gas station to get some cigarettes.
They took two separate cars.
Jermaine and Lamar were in Jermaine's SUV, while David and Richard took David's car.
So you got cigarettes?
Yeah.
After they left the gas station, the guys decided to go to a secluded area near I-94.
They're right next to one of those sound barriers that are next to that freeway.
Once there, all four of them gathered in Jermaine's SUV, where they dipped the cigarettes in PCP.
See, man, no hard feelings.
Yeah,
You know
sure.
how it is.
Yeah.
They were talking and laughing, and eventually they were gonna say goodnight.
Man, I messed up. You need me to drive? Yeah. Yeah.
David had to use the bathroom, so he stepped to a tree to urinate.
Richard was standing there. When I turned around, that's when it happened.
He turns around and he sees Jermaine get out the car with a gun.
He sees him shoot Richard 3 times.
And what did you do?
I hit the dirt, man. I thought he was gonna shoot me too.
Instead, Jermaine jumped back in the SUV with Lamar and they raced away. David says that as they fled the scene, he ran to his friend.
Oh, Lord, I got you, bro.
He wanted to drive his friend to the hospital, but Richard had his keys.
So he starts fumbling in Richard's pockets to see if he has them somewhere.
How can he find the keys?
David could not locate any car keys on Richard's body. He goes over to the vehicle, hoping that Richard has set the keys in there, but they're locked.
So, without a phone, David rushed for help.
David ran to the nearby housing projects and asked the guard at the desk to call 911.
When that didn't work, he tried getting on the bus to ask for help.
He's still dealing with the PCP. He's trying to figure out what to do, but everybody can see that he's high.
It's easy to kind of feel sorry for him.
Assuming he's telling the truth.
They only have David's word that Jermaine and Lamar were there.
All right, you're free to go.
But there may be a way to corroborate at least some of his story.
Detectives contact the gas station where David said the 4 men stopped to get cigarettes.
As they hoped, the gas station has security cameras.
They see on tape that Lamar and Jermaine, Richard, and David were all together at that gas station on the night of that murder.
The things that David has said are starting to line up with the facts.
Minneapolis detectives investigating the murder of Richard Jenkins have obtained surveillance video from a gas station that shows Richard with Jermaine Harris less than half an hour before he was shot.
Richard's friend David Dillon told police that he and Richard had been hanging out that night with Jermaine and his friend Lamar Dale, smoking cigarettes laced with PCP.
Now they have independent evidence to establish that it wasn't just Richard and David, it was also Lamar and Jermaine.
Detectives want to question both of them, if they can find them. They hope phone records can lead them to Jermaine.
They get a search warrant so they can dig into his phone. And one of the reasons you're looking for that is because of GPS, the ability to actually determine where that phone is located.
According to the GPS data, for the 48 hours following the murder, Jermaine's phone has been all across the Midwest.
The phone records indicate that Jermaine is on the run.
Jermaine is in Wisconsin. Jermaine is in Indiana. Jermaine is in Ohio. And so they're tracking him, but they can't get a hold of him yet.
However, Jermaine's friend, Lamar Dale, is still in Minneapolis. And 5 days after the murder, he's located at an apartment in the city.
When the police finally pick up somebody, you never know exactly how they're going to behave. Some people are violent, some people are angry, but sometimes people are relieved. That is exactly how Lamar is.
Brought in for questioning, Lamar agrees to give detectives a statement.
He said to police he was tired of looking over his shoulder.
Surprisingly, he was relieved. He was happy to not have to be on the run anymore.
Lamar acknowledged that there were scuffles and fights between Jermaine and Richard in the past.
Lamar says that he was there in July during the initial brawl.
Jermaine might have killed him out and stepped in.
And then he was also there later that night when Jermaine was shot in the leg.
So, did Richard shoot him?
I don't know. That's what Jermaine thought.
Jermaine vowed to get revenge on Richard.
Lamar goes as far as to say that he believes that Jermaine was stalking Richard.
And according to Lamar, he and Richard's friend, David Dillon, both tried to defuse the situation before things went too far.
Lamar said that in September, he and David sat down with Richard and Jermaine to talk it out.
They kind of agreed to let it go at that point.
So Jermaine didn't say anything else about wanting to get even with Richard?
No. Thought it was all good.
They all kind of got back together, would occasionally hang out. It wasn't all the way back to normal, but it was at least kind of tampered down.
When they ask about the night Richard was shot, Lamar claims he doesn't know anything.
He says he wasn't there, he wasn't involved, he has no idea what happened.
I swear, man.
He says, I never saw him that night. I don't know anything about this.
But detectives know that's a lie.
The police have videotape from a gas station showing these four men together.
So you didn't go out to I-94 with Jermaine?
After that, Lamar shuts up. He refuses to speak, and unfortunately, police didn't have enough to hold him, so they have to let him go.
There you go.
It's a disappointing end to the interview. But Lamar isn't really the one that the detectives are after.
Detectives get a tip Jermaine is back in town.
Jermaine was at a gas station, and someone called the police.
He's picked up and brought in for questioning.
They want to get to the bottom of why he could have possibly shot Richard.
So we heard you went out with Richard the night he was killed.
Man, I don't know anything about that.
He claims he had nothing to do with Richard's murder.
He also says he'd moved past being angry with Richard over Letitia.
Jermaine, he tells police, this is water under the bridge. We've settled our differences. I don't have a problem with Richard. I have no clue about any of the things that you guys are talking about.
However, Jermaine doesn't stop there.
Unlike Lamar, Jermaine admits that he's with Lamar and David and Richard that night.
This is a red flag to police.
I don't know, I wasn't there.
Lamar said he wasn't there. Jermaine said Lamar was there. These stories don't match, and now they know they're on to something.
Somebody's holding information back for some reason.
Was it possible that David, high on PCP, had misidentified the shooter?
Jermaine Harris has just admitted to detectives that he and his friend, Lamar Dale, had met up with Richard Jenkins and David Dillon on the night that Richard was killed.
The group did go to the gas station and had been smoking wet sticks that night.
But that isn't what Lamar had told investigators.
Lamar told them that they hadn't been hanging out together at all.
But Jermaine's story matches what Richard's friend, David Dillon, told him that night. And gas station surveillance videos showed the four men together.
And then what?
Nothing. That was it.
Jermaine told police that he and Lamar just went home. They were done for the night. So if something happened after that, Jermaine's like, I don't know, but when I left, they were all okay.
So then why did you leave town the next morning?
He said he took the next day off to go to Chicago to visit family.
But the detectives believe that's a lie.
You left town because you thought the whole thing would blow over, right?
No, I told you.
Well, you can just tell it to the jury then.
Jermaine is arrested for murder.
And hoping to prove it, the police and prosecutors lean on Jermaine's friend, Lamar.
The Hennepin County Attorney's Office subpoena Lamar to come in and tell the grand jury what he saw.
He admits that he saw his friend, Jermaine, shoot and kill Richard Jenkins.
To the district attorney, the case looks like a slam dunk.
The star witness for the prosecution is Lamar. He's there, he saw it happen, and he heard Jermaine say, "I shot him."
But when the case goes to trial in July of 2013, the jury hears something different.
Lamar changes his story. He says, I don't remember what happened that night.
He says the only reason why he said the story about Jermaine shooting Richard was because he felt pressure from the prosecution.
He felt like if he didn't say what they wanted to hear, he was going to get punished.
The judge has no choice but to declare a mistrial. But the district attorney refuses to give up.
The police and the prosecutors were determined.
The case goes to trial again with a change of strategy.
The charge against Jermaine was changed from first-degree premeditated murder to the lesser charge of second-degree intentional murder.
Lamar is called to the witness stand again.
This time, Lamar knew for sure that if he didn't give the prosecution all they wanted, he'd be tried as an accessory to murder.
And this time, Lamar comes through.
Lamar tells the truth this time.
Lamar tells the jury that on the night of November 21st, 2012, he, Jermaine Harris, David Dillon, and Richard Jenkins stopped at a secluded spot near Interstate 94 to smoke cigarettes laced with PCP.
The four of them climb into Jermaine's SUV and get high.
Richard, thinking he and Jermaine have buried the hatchet, gets out of the car with David.
But just as they're about to get into David's car to leave, there's a delay.
Straight? I'll be right back.
David had to go to the bathroom really bad, so he looked for a nearby tree.
All of a sudden, Jermaine gets out of the driver's seat of the SUV.
Yo, where you going?
Lamar says he had no idea what Jermaine was about to do.
Lamar goes on to say that he did hear several shots.
Yo, Jermaine, man, what you do?
He asked Jermaine, what happened, man? And Jermaine says, I shot him. And they both took off.
And that testimony is enough for the jury.
This time, there's no mistrial.
The jury finds Jermaine guilty of second-degree murder, and he is sentenced to 37 years in prison.
In Minnesota, he will serve 2/3 of that. So that means Jermaine is going to be an old man by the time he walks out of a jail cell.
By determination and perseverance in staying with this case and trying it, they were able not just to get a conviction, but to get a dangerous person off the streets.
The prosecutors, the family of Richard Jenkins, his girlfriend, they're all happy that finally justice has been served.
But justice can't replace what Jermaine's desire for revenge took from those who loved Richard Jenkins.
The world lost a caring brother, a boyfriend, and a father figure when his life was cut short.
Who knows what he could have done if he had been given the opportunity? It's easy to think about him as a statistic. He wasn't a statistic. He was a man who was hoping for a better life.
Every hospital has its own rhythm. During the day, hallways are filled with conversations between physicians and nurses, the squeak of medication carts rolling across polished floors, and the quiet reassurance offered to patients and families waiting for answers. At night, however, everything changes. The lights are dimmed, the corridors become quieter, and the ordinary sounds of a hospital seem amplified. The steady beeping of cardiac monitors replaces conversation. Footsteps echo farther. Doors open and close more gently. It is during those long overnight hours that every member of the medical staff hopes for something remarkably simple: a quiet shift. At the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts, that hope often disappeared the moment a loud announcement echoed through the hospital. Code Blue. Those two words carried enormous weight. In hospitals across the United States, a code blue signals one of the most urgent medical emergencies imaginable. It means a patient's heart has stopped beating effectively or breathing has suddenly ceased. Within seconds, doctors, nurses, respiratory therapists, and other emergency personnel race toward the room. Every second matters. Every decision could determine whether someone lives or dies. In most hospitals, a code blue is an uncommon event, especially within a single ward during a single shift. But during the mid-1990s, something about the Veterans Affairs Hospital seemed increasingly unusual. The emergency alarms were sounding more often than anyone expected. Patients who had appeared relatively stable suddenly collapsed without warning. Cardiac monitors erupted into frantic alarms. Medical teams rushed into patient rooms again and again, desperately attempting to reverse cardiac arrests that no one had anticipated only moments earlier. At first, the staff believed they were witnessing an unfortunate coincidence. The hospital treated elderly military veterans, many of whom had survived wars only to spend their later years battling heart disease, diabetes, cancer, chronic lung disease, and countless other medical conditions. Death, while always difficult, was not uncommon in such a setting. Doctors understood that fragile patients could deteriorate rapidly. Nurses knew that even with excellent care, some lives simply could not be saved. There was no obvious reason to suspect that anything more sinister was happening. Yet as weeks became months, a troubling pattern quietly emerged. Some nurses began exchanging uneasy glances after another emergency call. Physicians started recognizing familiar faces at nearly every resuscitation effort. It was not simply that cardiac arrests were occurring. It was where and when they seemed to happen. One name appeared again and again whenever the emergency response team assembled: Kristen Gilbert. To many of her colleagues, Kristen Gilbert represented everything people hoped for in an emergency nurse. She appeared calm under pressure, decisive during moments of chaos, and remarkably efficient when lives hung in the balance. While others sometimes hesitated during medical emergencies, Gilbert moved confidently. She knew the procedures. She anticipated physicians' requests. She appeared completely composed while performing some of the most stressful duties in medicine. Patients trusted her. Co-workers respected her. Supervisors regarded her as capable and experienced. In the aftermath of each code blue, surviving patients often owed their lives to the relentless efforts of entire medical teams working together under impossible pressure. Because Gilbert was frequently among the first responders, many viewed her as someone who consistently rose to the occasion when others needed her most. If anything, repeated emergencies seemed to reinforce her reputation rather than damage it. Some even viewed her as unusually dedicated because she was so often present when crises unfolded. But hospitals are places built upon observation. Every nurse notices patterns. Every physician develops instincts after years of practice. Over time, even small irregularities become difficult to ignore. Some staff members began asking quiet questions they never imagined they would have to ask. Why did so many medical emergencies occur during Kristen Gilbert's shifts? Why did patients suddenly experience catastrophic cardiac arrests shortly after appearing stable? Why did the hospital seem noticeably calmer when she was not working? No one initially suggested murder. Such an accusation was almost unimaginable inside a hospital devoted to caring for military. Veterans. Healthcare professionals dedicate their careers to preserving life, not taking it. The very idea that a nurse could intentionally harm patients challenged one of the deepest assumptions upon which modern medicine depends. Trust. Every patient who enters a hospital places extraordinary faith in strangers. They allow physicians to prescribe medications they cannot verify. They permit nurses to administer injections they do not fully understand. They surrender control because they believe every person wearing a medical uniform shares the same purpose: to help them recover. That trust forms the foundation of healthcare itself. Without it, hospitals cannot function. For that reason, the possibility that someone inside the system might deliberately exploit vulnerable patients is often the last explanation anyone wants to consider. At the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, the victims were not anonymous statistics. They were men who had once served their country in uniform. Many had survived combat, endured years of military service, and returned home carrying physical and emotional scars that lasted a lifetime. Now elderly, many relied entirely upon the hospital entrusted with their care. Their families believed they were safe. Their fellow veterans believed they were among professionals dedicated to honoring their service. Through compassionate treatment, no one imagined that the greatest danger might come from someone assigned to protect them. As more cardiac arrests occurred, rumors quietly circulated among members of the nursing staff. Some dismissed the growing concern as coincidence. Others suggested that Gilbert simply happened to work the busiest shifts or cared for the sickest. Patients. Hospitals often experience clusters of deaths, particularly among elderly populations. Statistics can sometimes produce unsettling patterns without implying criminal behavior. Even so, certain observations became increasingly difficult to explain away. Nurses who had worked together for years noticed that code blue calls appeared unusually frequent. Whenever Gilbert was assigned to duty, some jokingly remarked that emergencies seemed to follow her wherever she worked. At the time, these comments were not accusations. They reflected the uneasy humor healthcare workers sometimes used to cope with repeated exposure to death. No one realized that those casual observations would later become significant pieces of a much larger investigation. The atmosphere inside the hospital slowly changed. Staff members who had once looked forward to quiet overnight shifts found themselves anticipating the next emergency alarm. Each unexpected cardiac arrest demanded another frantic effort to save a patient whose condition had not seemed critical only moments before. Every unsuccessful resuscitation weighed heavily on the doctors and nurses involved. In medicine, losing a patient is never routine, even when death is expected. Unexpected loss leaves even deeper questions behind. Yet every time uncertainty surfaced, there appeared to be a reasonable explanation. Advanced age, chronic illness, underlying heart disease, complications that no one could have predicted. Each individual death could be understood on its own. It was only when viewed together that a disturbing picture slowly began to emerge. The mystery surrounding Kristen Gilbert would ultimately become one of the most infamous criminal cases in American medical history. Prosecutors would later argue that the woman many believed to be saving lives had instead been creating the very emergencies that made her appear heroic. They alleged that her motive was neither financial gain nor personal revenge, but something far more unsettling: a desire for attention, admiration, and recognition during moments of crisis. Those allegations would eventually lead to one of the most closely watched healthcare murder trials in the United States. But in the beginning, none of that was visible. There was only a respected nurse, an aging veterans hospital, and an unsettling series of emergencies that seemed impossible to explain. Before investigators examined medication records, before co-workers came forward with their suspicions, before federal agents entered the hospital, and before a courtroom would hear months of testimony, there was simply one question quietly spreading through the corridors of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Why did the code blue alarm seem to ring so often whenever Kristen Gilbert was on duty. That question would become the starting point of an investigation that challenged assumptions about trust, medicine, and the hidden dangers that can exist even in places built for healing. Before investigators would scrutinize medication records, before prosecutors would stand before a federal jury, and long before the name Kristen Gilbert became synonymous with one of the most disturbing healthcare murder cases in modern American history, she was simply another nurse beginning a promising career. There was nothing immediately extraordinary about the path that brought her to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. Like countless healthcare professionals across the United States, Kristen Gilbert entered nursing after completing her education, choosing a profession built upon compassion, technical skill, and responsibility. Nursing demands far more than administering medications or recording vital signs. It requires constant observation, rapid decision-making, emotional resilience, and the ability to remain calm while others panic. Patients often spend more time with nurses than with physicians, making those relationships essential to both treatment and recovery. Families trust nurses to advocate for loved ones who are too weak to speak for themselves. Physicians rely on nurses to notice subtle changes that might signal worsening conditions. Within a hospital, nurses become the steady presence that patients see throughout every hour of the day and night. In 1989, Kristen Gilbert joined the staff of the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton. The facility was part of the federal healthcare system established specifically to care for military veterans. Unlike many civilian hospitals that serve patients of every age, the Northampton VA treated a population with unique medical needs. Most of its patients were older men who had served in the United States Armed Forces decades earlier. Many lived with chronic illnesses that reflected both advancing age and the lasting physical consequences of military service. Heart disease was common. Diabetes affected many patients. Chronic lung conditions, cancer, kidney disease, and vascular disorders were frequent diagnoses. Some veterans carried visible physical disabilities, while others faced illnesses that had gradually developed over years. For hospital staff, caring for these patients required patience and consistency rather than dramatic medical interventions. Many admissions focused on managing chronic disease rather than curing it. The reality of such a hospital was simple but sobering. Despite every effort made by doctors and nurses, death was an expected part of daily life. Elderly patients sometimes declined suddenly despite appearing stable only hours before. Complications developed quickly. Cardiac arrests occurred without warning. Families often understood that every admission might be their loved one's last. Within this environment, individual deaths rarely triggered suspicion because they fit the difficult realities of caring for medically fragile patients. When Kristen Gilbert began working at the hospital, she quickly established herself as a capable member of the nursing staff. Coworkers viewed her as intelligent, energetic, and technically skilled. She appeared confident while performing demanding clinical responsibilities and demonstrated an ability to remain composed during stressful situations. Those qualities earned respect from colleagues who depended upon one another during long shifts. Caring for critically ill patients. Outside the hospital, Gilbert cultivated the image of stability. She married and became the mother of 2 children. To many people who knew her, she appeared to embody the balance that many healthcare workers strive to achieve, maintaining a demanding professional career while raising a family. There was little about her public image that suggested the extraordinary criminal allegations that would later emerge. Yet prosecutors would eventually present a markedly different portrait of Gilbert's personality. According to evidence introduced during her trial, people who knew her described patterns of behavior that contrasted sharply with the caring image she projected in the hospital. Witnesses described someone who frequently sought to become the center of attention. They alleged that she manipulated those around her, fabricated or exaggerated illnesses, and displayed troubling behavioral patterns long before investigators began examining patient deaths. Prosecutors also introduced evidence concerning earlier violent or dangerous behavior, arguing that these incidents reflected an escalation that eventually culminated in the crimes charged at trial. Those claims became part of the broader narrative presented by the government, although they were considered alongside all other evidence by the jury rather than serving as proof of the murders themselves. At the time, however, none of those concerns defined how most co-workers viewed Gilbert. Hospitals are environments where trust develops through shared experience. Nurses rely upon each other during exhausting overnight shifts. They assist one another during emergencies, exchange critical information about patients, and often form close professional relationships built upon mutual confidence. Questioning a colleague's integrity is not something that occurs lightly. For years, there appeared to be no reason to doubt Kristen Gilbert's commitment to patient care. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center itself reinforced that sense of security. Unlike a large urban trauma center overwhelmed by constant emergencies, Northampton's VA hospital focused primarily on long-term medical management for veterans. The pace could be busy, but much of the work involved monitoring chronic illnesses, adjusting medications, and helping elderly patients maintain stability. Many veterans returned repeatedly for treatment, allowing nurses to know them personally over months or even years. Conversations extended beyond medical charts. Staff learned about patients' military service, their families, and the lives they had built after returning from war. That familiarity created an atmosphere distinct from many hospitals. Patients were not anonymous faces passing briefly through an emergency department. They were individuals whose histories were well known to the people caring for them. Because of that environment, compassion and continuity of care became defining features of the hospital's culture. Nurses celebrated improvements in patients' health and mourned losses alongside families. Death remained a difficult reality, but it was approached with dignity and respect. No one imagined that the routines designed to protect vulnerable patients could potentially be exploited. During Gilbert's first several years at the hospital, nothing publicly suggested an unfolding tragedy. She continued performing her responsibilities, earning positive evaluations, and maintaining the confidence of colleagues. If anyone had predicted that she would eventually become the subject of a federal murder investigation, such a claim would likely have seemed absurd. The transformation from respected nurse to criminal suspect did not occur overnight. Instead, it unfolded gradually through a series of observations that initially appeared disconnected. Around 1994 and continuing into 1995, physicians and nurses began noticing subtle changes within the hospital. There seemed to be more emergency cardiac events than usual. Patients who had appeared relatively stable unexpectedly experienced life-threatening arrhythmias or sudden cardiac arrests. Each individual incident could be explained medically. Elderly veterans with multiple chronic illnesses are always at risk for sudden deterioration. Yet the frequency with which these emergencies occurred slowly began attracting attention. Initially, no one interpreted the pattern as evidence of criminal conduct. Healthcare professionals are trained to seek medical explanations before considering extraordinary possibilities. Random clusters of deaths occur in hospitals from time to time without indicating wrongdoing. Variations in patient populations, seasonal illnesses, and simple coincidence can all produce temporary increases in mortality. The staff therefore continued working under the assumption that they were witnessing an unfortunate but natural fluctuation. Nevertheless, some observations proved increasingly difficult to dismiss. Code blue emergencies appeared to occur with unusual frequency during Gilbert's shifts. Whenever patients suddenly required emergency resuscitation, she often seemed to be nearby. Rather than raising immediate suspicion, this initially enhanced her professional reputation. She was repeatedly present during critical moments because she happened to be on duty when patients deteriorated. Her calm responses under pressure reinforced the perception that she was one of the hospital's strongest emergency nurses. Ironically, The very circumstances that would later contribute to investigators' suspicions first made Gilbert appear indispensable. Every successful resuscitation strengthened confidence in her abilities. Every rapid response demonstrated competence. Every emergency reinforced the image of a nurse willing to confront crisis without hesitation. Few people pause to ask why so many crises seem to occur in the first place. Hospitals naturally celebrate those who perform well during emergencies. Heroism in medicine is measured not through dramatic speeches, but through decisive action during moments when lives hang in the balance. Gilbert appeared to fit that image perfectly. Yet beneath that appearance, prosecutors would later argue, a profoundly different reality existed. According to their theory, the emergencies themselves were not random tragedies, but carefully created opportunities. That allegation would not emerge until much later, after months of investigation and years of legal proceedings. During the mid-1990s, however, the staff at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center still believed they were working beside a dedicated professional committed to saving lives. The hospital remained a place where aging veterans sought healing, where families entrusted loved ones to experienced caregivers, and where nurses continued their demanding work believing that every member of the team shared the same mission. What no one fully understood was that a subtle pattern had already begun taking shape. Cardiac arrests were becoming more frequent. Emergency alarms were sounding more often. And although the connection was still little more than an uneasy feeling shared quietly among a handful of observant coworkers, one name continued appearing at the center of those increasingly troubling moments: Kristen Gilbert. That pattern, still hidden beneath the ordinary realities of hospital life, would soon become impossible for some members of the nursing staff to ignore. By the middle of the 1990s, the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton continued to operate much as it always had. Elderly veterans arrived for treatment of chronic illnesses. Nurses rotated through demanding shifts. Physicians evaluated patients whose health often fluctuated from day to day. And families placed their trust in a hospital that had long been dedicated to caring for those who had once served their country. On the surface, nothing suggested that one of the most notorious healthcare murder investigations in American history was quietly taking shape. Yet beneath the routine of daily hospital life, an unsettling pattern was becoming increasingly difficult for some members of the staff to ignore. Hospitals expect occasional emergencies. No matter how carefully patients are monitored, the human body can deteriorate without warning. A heart weakened by years of disease may suddenly stop beating effectively. A seemingly stable patient may experience an unexpected arrhythmia. Doctors and nurses train extensively for precisely these moments because they understand that medicine can never eliminate uncertainty. A code blue is therefore not unusual by itself. What drew attention inside the Northampton VA hospital was not the existence of cardiac arrests, but their frequency, and more importantly, the circumstances under which they seemed to occur. During Gilbert's shifts, emergency calls appeared to happen far more often than many nurses remembered experiencing during comparable periods. Some nights that had begun quietly would suddenly be interrupted by one emergency after another. Cardiac monitors would alarm. Staff would rush toward another patient's room. Emergency carts would be pushed rapidly through the hallways. Physicians would attempt resuscitation while nurses administered medications, monitored heart rhythms, and documented every intervention. Sometimes patients survived. Many did not. Every unsuccessful resuscitation left behind exhausted medical professionals and grieving families. Every death was carefully documented according to hospital procedures. At first, those records simply became part of the ordinary administrative work that follows every patient death. No one believed they were documenting evidence for a future criminal investigation. The hospital population itself seemed to explain the rising number of emergencies. Most patients were elderly men with multiple serious illnesses. Many suffered from cardiovascular disease, severe enough to place them at constant risk of sudden deterioration. Some had survived previous heart attacks. Others lived with diabetes, chronic lung disease, kidney failure, or cancer. In such an environment, unexpected deaths, while tragic, were medically plausible. Every physician understood that even the best treatment could not reverse decades of declining health. Because of that reality, no one initially questioned why patients were dying. Instead, a different question gradually emerged. Why did so many of those deaths appear connected to the same nurse? Kristen Gilbert was almost always present when another code blue was announced. Sometimes she had been caring directly for the patient. Other times she was working nearby and became one of the first responders once the emergency began. Her repeated presence during crises initially strengthened rather than weakened her professional reputation. Coworkers admired her ability to remain composed under extraordinary pressure. She appeared decisive, organized, and technically proficient. In the emotionally charged environment of emergency resuscitation, calmness inspires confidence. While family members waited anxiously outside patient rooms and physicians concentrated on complex medical decisions, Gilbert consistently appeared focused on the work before her. To many colleagues, she looked exactly like the kind of nurse every hospital hoped to have during an emergency. As the number of code blue calls increased, some members of the staff even began viewing her as unusually reliable because she was so often involved in resuscitation efforts. The repeated emergencies seemed to demonstrate her experience rather than raise suspicion. Yet beneath that admiration, quiet conversations had already begun. Experienced nurses spend years developing instincts that cannot always be explained through statistics alone. They notice subtle changes in patient behavior before vital signs reveal obvious deterioration. They remember which patients seemed stable only hours earlier. They recognize patterns that might escape someone reviewing medical charts months later. Several nurses began sharing the same uncomfortable observation. Whenever Gilbert was working, the atmosphere seemed different. There appeared to be more sudden cardiac arrests, more emergency alarms, more frantic attempts to revive patients who had not previously appeared to be in immediate danger. At first, those observations remained private. Few healthcare professionals would casually accuse a colleague of wrongdoing, especially someone with a reputation for competence. Instead, the concerns were often expressed through dark humor, a coping mechanism common in high-stress medical environments. Some jokingly remarked that death seemed to follow Gilbert through the hospital. Others referred to her as unusually unlucky, suggesting that she simply happened to be present whenever patients deteriorated. Those comments carried no formal accusation. They reflected discomfort rather than certainty. Still, the repetition of those remarks revealed that more than one person had begun noticing the same pattern. Around the same period, another development entered Gilbert's personal life that would later become a central focus during her criminal trial. In approximately 1995, she began an extramarital relationship with James Perot, a hospital security officer. Unlike nurses and physicians assigned to patient care, Perot's responsibilities centered on maintaining order and responding to incidents requiring security assistance. Under normal circumstances, their professional duties would have brought them into contact only occasionally. Hospitals, however, operate according to established emergency protocols. Whenever a code blue is announced, multiple departments respond simultaneously. Physicians hurry toward the patient's room. Nurses gather emergency equipment. Respiratory therapists prepare airway support. Hospital security also responds, helping control access to treatment areas and ensuring that emergency personnel can work without interference. This procedural detail would later become critically important. Prosecutors argued that Gilbert's relationship with Perot provided a motive unlike those found in many serial murder cases. According to the government's theory, she was not seeking financial gain. There was no evidence that she benefited from insurance policies or inheritance. Nor did prosecutors argue that she killed out of revenge or personal hatred toward specific patients. Instead, they presented a motive centered on attention and recognition. They argued that emergency situations allowed Gilbert to place herself at the center of dramatic life-or-death events. Every code blue brought together physicians, nurses, and security personnel, including James Perot. More emergencies meant more opportunities for Gilbert to interact with the man with whom she was involved. Witnesses later testified that Gilbert appeared unusually excited whenever Perot arrived during emergency responses. Prosecutors suggested that this behavior reflected a desire not merely to see him, but to occupy the role of heroic rescuer before both colleagues and her romantic partner. Whether viewed as a search for admiration, excitement, or attention, the alleged motive differed significantly from more familiar criminal motivations. The prosecution would later argue that Gilbert valued the recognition associated with saving lives, even if, according to their theory, she had first created the very emergencies requiring rescue. At the time, however, these ideas remained unknown to nearly everyone working inside the hospital. The affair itself was not widely understood as having any connection to patient care. Co-workers continued focusing on their demanding responsibilities while emergency calls persisted. Yet another question slowly emerged among those paying closest attention. Why did some patients experience catastrophic cardiac arrests despite showing no immediate signs of severe decline? Medicine is never entirely predictable, but experienced clinicians often develop reasonable expectations regarding a patient's condition. Some individuals are clearly approaching the end of life. Others appear stable despite chronic illness. Several of the patients who suddenly arrested did not seem, according to later testimony, to be in immediate danger only moments before their collapse. That observation did not prove criminal conduct. Serious medical events can occur unexpectedly even in apparently stable patients. Nevertheless, each unexplained deterioration added another piece to an increasingly troubling picture. Individually, every emergency could be explained through natural disease. Collectively, they began to suggest something that experienced staff members struggled to dismiss. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center remained a place devoted to healing, and most employees continued believing that every member of the healthcare team shared that mission. Trust still defined relationships between co-workers. Patients continued relying upon nurses to administer medications, monitor intravenous lines, and provide compassionate care. Families believed their loved ones were protected by a system designed to preserve life. No one entering the hospital imagined that ordinary medical procedures could conceal extraordinary crimes. Yet as 1995 progressed, the growing number of code blue emergencies, the repeated presence of Kristen Gilbert during those crises, and the quiet concerns circulating among experienced nurses marked the beginning of a profound shift. What had once been dismissed as coincidence was slowly becoming a pattern. What had once been explained as unfortunate timing was beginning to challenge even the most cautious observers. Suspicion, however, is not proof. Hospitals cannot function on rumor, and criminal accusations require evidence far stronger than uneasy feelings. For months, those concerns remained little more than whispered conversations exchanged between trusted co-workers after another exhausting shift. The questions continued accumulating, but answers remained elusive. Unknown to nearly everyone inside the hospital, the evidence that would eventually transform those private doubts into a federal murder investigation was already beginning to emerge. The next stage of the story would not begin with a dramatic confession or a single unmistakable mistake. Instead, it would begin with careful observation by a small group of nurses who refused to dismiss what they were seeing, choosing instead to document a pattern that others still hoped was nothing more than an impossible coincidence. By the time concerns inside the Veterans Affairs Medical Center had begun spreading quietly among a handful of nurses and physicians, investigators still had no definitive explanation for the growing number of sudden cardiac emergencies. Hospitals are places where lives hang in delicate balance and unexpected deaths particularly among elderly patients with chronic illnesses, are an unfortunate reality. Every patient admitted to the Northampton VA hospital carried a complicated medical history. Many had survived decades after military service only to face advanced heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illness, cancer, or other conditions that made them medically fragile. If one patient suffered cardiac arrest, few would question it. If several patients died over the course of a month, the hospital's population alone could provide a reasonable explanation. But investigators would eventually argue that what appeared to be natural medical emergencies concealed a deliberate pattern. According to federal prosecutors, the sudden collapses were not always the result of disease alone. Instead, they alleged that someone with specialized medical knowledge had learned how to transform an ordinary hospital treatment into a lethal opportunity while leaving behind very little immediate evidence. Central to that theory was a medication found in virtually every hospital emergency department: epinephrine, more commonly known as adrenaline. Epinephrine is one of the most important emergency drugs in modern medicine. It is routinely used during life-threatening situations because of its powerful effects on the cardiovascular system. When a patient's heart stops beating effectively, epinephrine can stimulate cardiac activity, increase blood pressure, and improve the chances that circulation will return during resuscitation. For healthcare professionals responding to a code blue, the medication is often associated with hope rather than danger. It is intended to save lives when administered appropriately under emergency conditions. Yet, like many powerful medications, epinephrine can become dangerous when used incorrectly. Prosecutors argued that this dual nature made it an ideal instrument for someone possessing clinical knowledge. According to the government's theory presented at trial, administering epinephrine to a patient who was not experiencing cardiac arrest could trigger catastrophic consequences, particularly in elderly individuals already living with heart disease. Instead of restoring normal cardiac function, an unnecessary dose could provoke severe arrhythmias, destabilize the heart's electrical activity, and ultimately lead to cardiac arrest. That allegation became the foundation of the prosecution's explanation for the unexplained emergencies that had troubled the hospital. According to the evidence presented in court, investigators believed Gilbert selected patients who shared several important characteristics. They were typically elderly veterans already suffering from significant medical conditions. Many required intravenous therapy, meaning they already had 4 lines through which medications and fluids could be administered. Their fragile health also meant that sudden deterioration, while unexpected, could initially appear medically plausible. Prosecutors alleged that Gilbert exploited those circumstances. Rather than openly administering medication in a way that would immediately attract attention, they argued that she secretly introduced epinephrine into a patient's intravenous line when others were not watching. The process described during the trial required neither dramatic confrontation nor obvious violence. Because the patients already had 4 access established as part of their treatment, investigators argued that introducing medication could occur quickly and without immediately alarming those nearby. According to the prosecution's theory, the consequences unfolded within minutes. A patient who had appeared relatively stable would suddenly experience profound disturbances in heart rhythm. Monitors would begin sounding alarms. Nurses would recognize the emergency. Someone would immediately call a code blue. Within moments, physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, and hospital security would converge on the room in a coordinated attempt to save the patient's life. At that point, prosecutors alleged, Gilbert assumed the role that had helped establish her reputation throughout the hospital. She became one of the first responders, participating in frantic resuscitation efforts alongside her colleagues. To those witnessing the emergency, she appeared exactly as a dedicated nurse should appear, focused, composed, and determined to save a critically ill patient. If the patient survived, Gilbert participated in what appeared to be a successful emergency response. If the patient died, the death could easily be attributed to natural illness. Given the patient's age and medical history, investigators later argued that this combination of medical vulnerability and apparent heroism made the alleged crimes exceptionally difficult to detect. The very setting in which they occurred worked against immediate suspicion. Hospitals expect emergencies. Nurses routinely administer medications. Elderly patients sometimes deteriorate without warning. None of those facts, considered individually, suggested criminal conduct. That is precisely why, according to prosecutors, the alleged pattern continued for so long before attracting serious attention. Another challenge facing investigators was the absence of direct eyewitnesses. No one testified that they personally saw Gilbert inject epinephrine into a patient's intravenous line. The prosecution's case therefore relied upon the cumulative weight of medical findings. Hospital records, medication evidence, witness testimony, and statistical analysis rather than a single dramatic observation. As investigators reconstructed events, they focused closely on individual patient deaths that appeared especially suspicious. Among those cases was Stanley Jagodowski, one of the 4 veterans whose death ultimately formed part of the federal murder convictions. According to the evidence presented during trial, Jagodowski had been recovering relatively well before unexpectedly suffering cardiac arrest. His sudden collapse surprised members of the medical staff because his condition had not suggested an immediate life-threatening emergency. Subsequent examination became particularly significant because unusually high levels of epinephrine were identified, providing investigators with evidence that supported the prosecution's theory regarding the alleged method of murder. That finding distinguished the case from many hospital deaths that could be explained solely through underlying illness. Another patient, Henry Huden, similarly became part of the prosecution's case. Huden was hospitalized for medical treatment and, according to the information presented by prosecutors, was not expected to suffer sudden cardiac arrest at the time of his death. Nevertheless, he unexpectedly deteriorated while Gilbert was present. Like other cases examined during the investigation, the circumstances surrounding his death contributed to investigators' belief that the pattern extended beyond coincidence. Kenneth Cutting's death further reinforced those suspicions. Although he was receiving treatment for chronic medical problems, prosecutors argued that his sudden cardiac collapse occurred under circumstances remarkably similar to other unexplained emergencies linked to Gilbert's shifts. Investigators compared hospital records, staffing schedules, medication documentation, and the sequence of medical events, concluding that another unexpected cardiac arrest had occurred after Gilbert had contact with the patient. The 4th murder conviction involved Edward Squira. By the time investigators carefully reconstructed the circumstances surrounding his death, the pattern they believed they had uncovered had become increasingly difficult to dismiss. Individually, each patient possessed medical conditions capable of causing serious complications. Viewed together, however, prosecutors argued that the similarities were striking. Elderly veterans, unexpected cardiac arrests, Gilbert's presence, emergencies unfolding with little warning. Each incident added another layer to the government's theory that the deaths were connected through deliberate human action rather than natural disease alone. Even with these similarities, investigators understood that criminal prosecution required extraordinary caution. Hospitals are inherently complex environments where critically ill patients receive numerous medications from multiple healthcare providers. A mistaken accusation against a medical professional could have devastating consequences. For that reason, authorities examined every available piece of evidence before reaching conclusions. They reviewed medication inventories, patient records, staffing schedules, and witness statements while seeking scientific support for the theory that epinephrine had been used improperly. The prosecution's argument did not depend solely upon the existence of patient deaths. Instead, it emphasized the consistency of the alleged method. According to their theory, the same sequence repeated itself again and again. A vulnerable patient, access through an existing intravenous line, a sudden and unexpected cardiac emergency, A rapid code blue response. Gilbert's immediate participation in resuscitation efforts. Whether the patient survived or died, she remained positioned as an essential member of the emergency team. Prosecutors argued that this repeated sequence demonstrated planning rather than coincidence. The defense, however, would later challenge virtually every aspect of that theory. They emphasized that all of the patients involved were already seriously ill. They argued that elderly veterans frequently suffer unpredictable cardiac events. They noted the absence of eyewitness testimony showing Gilbert administering unauthorized injections. They maintained that much of the prosecution's case relied upon circumstantial evidence rather than direct observation. These competing interpretations would eventually become central issues during the federal trial. At this stage of the investigation, however, authorities were still assembling the puzzle. Individual patient deaths that once appeared unrelated were gradually being connected through careful review of medical evidence and hospital documentation. Investigators were no longer asking whether an unusual number of cardiac arrests had occurred. They were beginning to ask whether those emergencies had been intentionally created. Yet proving such an extraordinary allegation required far more than suspicion. It required demonstrating that what appeared to be ordinary medical tragedy actually concealed deliberate criminal conduct. As investigators continued examining records and interviewing hospital staff, another crucial development was quietly taking place elsewhere inside the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. A small group of nurses had begun independently documenting the same troubling patterns that federal investigators were uncovering. Their observations would soon provide one of the most important turning points in the entire investigation, transforming isolated concerns into coordinated evidence that the growing number of unexplained emergencies could no longer be dismissed as coincidence alone. Every major criminal investigation reaches a moment when suspicion begins to evolve into something more substantial. It is rarely the result of a single dramatic discovery. More often, it develops through the careful observations of ordinary people who notice that small inconsistencies continue repeating until they can no longer be explained away. In the case of Kristen Gilbert, that turning point did not begin with a confession, hidden surveillance, or an eyewitness account. Instead, it began with several experienced nurses who trusted their professional instincts enough to question what everyone else still hoped was merely an extraordinary coincidence. By 1996, the atmosphere inside the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. Cardiac emergencies had become a recurring feature of certain shifts. Code blue announcements, once viewed as unfortunate but isolated events, now seemed frequent enough that some members of the staff found themselves anticipating the next emergency before the current one had fully ended. Physicians and nurses remained committed to providing the best possible care, but many also carried a growing sense of unease that was difficult to express. Healthcare professionals are trained to rely on evidence rather than intuition. They understand that medicine is filled with unpredictable outcomes, especially among elderly patients with multiple chronic illnesses. Because of that training, few were willing to draw immediate conclusions from a pattern that could, at least in theory, still be explained by chance. Yet experience has value that cannot always be measured statistically. Nurses who spend years caring for critically ill patients develop an extraordinary awareness of their environment. They remember who was assigned to each room. They recall which patients seemed stable only hours before a sudden decline. They recognize when the rhythm of an entire ward begins to feel different. 3 nurses working at the hospital gradually realized they were all noticing the same disturbing trend. Patients appeared to suffer unexpected cardiac arrests with unusual frequency during Kristen Gilbert's shifts. More importantly, when Gilbert was absent from work, the number of code blue emergencies appeared to decline noticeably. At first, this observation remained nothing more than conversation between trusted colleagues. None of them wanted to believe that a fellow nurse could intentionally harm patients. Such an accusation challenged everything they believed about their profession. Nursing is built upon compassion, responsibility, and trust. To suspect another nurse of deliberately endangering vulnerable patients was emotionally difficult, as well as professionally unsettling. Rather than making immediate accusations, the nurses chose a more careful approach. They began paying closer attention. Instead of relying on memory alone, they started comparing facts. They looked at work schedules, noting which nurses were on duty during medical emergencies. They examined the timing of unexpected deaths. They asked themselves whether the apparent pattern would continue if they observed it objectively. Instead of relying upon personal impressions, their efforts reflected the same disciplined thinking expected throughout healthcare. Assumptions were not enough. Observations needed to be tested against evidence. As weeks passed, the pattern did not disappear. Instead, it became increasingly consistent. The same name continued appearing whenever records were reviewed. Kristen Gilbert had been present during an unusually large number of sudden cardiac emergencies. The nurses also became concerned about another issue that seemed unrelated at first, but gradually appeared connected. Supplies of epinephrine were reportedly diminishing in ways that could not easily be explained. Epinephrine was a legitimate emergency medication routinely stocked throughout the hospital for life-saving treatment. Because it was commonly used during cardiac arrests, some variation in inventory was expected. However, investigators would later examine whether the amount being used corresponded appropriately with documented medical emergencies. The nurses themselves were not conducting a criminal investigation, nor did they possess the authority to accuse anyone formally. Their responsibility was simply to report concerns when patient safety appeared threatened. That duty, fundamental to every healthcare profession, required them to speak up when repeated observations suggested that something inside the hospital might not be right. Reporting another nurse was not a decision made lightly. Professional relationships inside hospitals depend heavily upon mutual confidence. Nurses rely upon one another during demanding shifts. Trusting colleagues to administer medications correctly, communicate honestly, and respond appropriately during emergencies. Breaking that trust by expressing suspicion carries significant emotional consequences. The three nurses therefore focused not on personal opinions, but on observable facts. Patients had experienced unexpected cardiac arrests. Those emergencies appeared clustered around Gilbert's shifts. Medication use raised additional questions. These were concerns that hospital leadership needed to evaluate independently. In 1996, those observations were formally reported, initiating what would become the first official step toward a comprehensive investigation. Hospital administrators now faced a difficult challenge. On one hand, accusations against an experienced nurse could seriously damage careers and reputations if unsupported. On the other hand, ignoring credible concerns involving patient safety would represent an unacceptable failure of responsibility. Rather than confronting Gilbert immediately, the hospital began examining available information more carefully. Administrators reviewed patient records and staffing schedules while attempting to determine whether the reported pattern reflected coincidence or something requiring deeper investigation. The process remained deliberately confidential. If the concerns ultimately proved unfounded, unnecessary publicity could unjustly harm an employee. Conversely, if the suspicions proved accurate, alerting a potential suspect prematurely might interfere with any future investigation. As additional records were reviewed, the concerns reported by the nurses became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Investigators began comparing cardiac arrest incidents with staffing assignments over extended periods rather than isolated days. They examined when emergencies occurred, who had been caring for individual patients, and whether any consistent relationships existed between those events. One aspect of the government's later case involved statistical analysis. Prosecutors argued that Gilbert had been present during approximately half of the roughly 350 patient deaths that occurred while she worked at the hospital. Experts presented statistical evidence suggesting that such a concentration was extraordinarily unlikely to have resulted from chance alone. At the same time, investigators and prosecutors carefully distinguished between statistical improbability and proof of homicide. Statistics may indicate that a pattern deserves investigation, but they cannot establish criminal guilt by themselves. This distinction remained critically important throughout the case. Although many deaths occurred during Gilbert's years at the hospital, the legal system ultimately required proof beyond a reasonable doubt for each individual murder charge. The statistical evidence therefore functioned as one component of a much larger body of evidence, rather than a substitute for direct medical and investigative findings. As the hospital's internal review continued, outside authorities gradually became involved. Because the Veterans Affairs Medical Center was a federal institution, the investigation extended beyond local hospital administration. Federal investigators joined the effort, bringing additional resources and expertise. Their work expanded far beyond reviewing patient charts. Investigators carefully examined medication records, attempting to identify discrepancies involving epinephrine. They reviewed nursing documentation to reconstruct patient care before each unexplained cardiac arrest. Staffing schedules were analyzed in detail to determine who had access to patients immediately. Before emergencies occurred, interviews were conducted with physicians, nurses, pharmacists, and other hospital employees who might provide information about daily routines or unusual observations. Federal investigators also compared multiple cases side by side rather than treating each death as an isolated event. Similarities gradually emerged. Patients who had not appeared to be in immediate danger suddenly suffered catastrophic cardiac events. Gilbert was repeatedly associated with those incidents through her work assignments. Medication evidence, patient histories, and witness statements began forming a broader picture that investigators believed warranted continued examination. Throughout this period, secrecy remained essential. Few hospital employees understood the full scope of the investigation taking place around them. Daily operations continued. Veterans continued receiving medical care. Doctors and nurses continued working long shifts. Most patients and families remained completely unaware that federal authorities were quietly examining years of medical records inside the very hospital entrusted with their care. For investigators, patients became one of the most valuable tools available. Complex healthcare cases cannot be solved quickly. Every medical event requires careful analysis because natural illness must always be excluded before criminal explanations can be considered. Elderly patients frequently experience unpredictable complications. Medications may produce unexpected effects. Chronic diseases often progress rapidly despite appropriate treatment. Each possibility had to be evaluated thoroughly before any conclusion could be reached. As more evidence accumulated, however, the investigation steadily moved beyond generalized concern toward focused suspicion. The observations first made by 3 attentive nurses had now become the foundation of a federal inquiry involving extensive document review, witness interviews, medication analysis, and statistical evaluation. The case was no longer built upon instinct alone. It was becoming an increasingly detailed reconstruction of events spanning several years inside one hospital ward. Yet just as investigators were assembling this growing body of evidence, another unexpected development threatened to disrupt the entire process. Rather than quietly allowing the investigation to proceed, Kristen Gilbert would soon become involved in conduct that drew additional attention from law enforcement. Anonymous bomb threats directed at the hospital would trigger evacuations, create widespread disruption, and ultimately lead investigators to conclusions that extended far beyond patient deaths. What began as an inquiry into unexplained medical emergencies was about to expand into a broader criminal investigation, bringing federal authorities even closer to uncovering one of the most disturbing betrayals of trust ever alleged within an American hospital. By the time federal investigators had begun reviewing years of patient records at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, the investigation had already become far more complex than anyone had initially imagined. What had started with quiet concerns raised by a small group of nurses had expanded into a meticulous examination of hospital documentation, staffing schedules, medication inventories, and unexplained cardiac emergencies. Investigators understood that proving a healthcare professional had deliberately harmed patients would require an exceptionally strong body of evidence. Hospitals are environments where people become critically ill every day, and elderly patients often die despite receiving appropriate medical care. Every conclusion, therefore, had to withstand careful scientific and legal scrutiny. As authorities continued gathering information, an unexpected series of events dramatically altered the course of the investigation. Rather than remaining focused solely on suspicious patient deaths, federal agents suddenly found themselves investigating another crime occurring within the same hospital. Anonymous bomb threats began targeting the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. Whenever such a threat was received, hospital administrators had no choice but to respond immediately. Even if the caller's claims eventually proved false, every report had to be treated as a genuine emergency. Hospitals cannot afford to gamble with the safety of patients, visitors, or medical staff. Evacuations and emergency procedures disrupted ordinary operations, diverted personnel, and forced administrators to concentrate on protecting everyone inside the facility. For a hospital already under quiet internal scrutiny, the repeated threats created confusion and significant operational difficulties. Patient care had to continue despite uncertainty. Medical personnel were forced to balance ongoing treatment with emergency safety procedures. Investigative work that depended upon careful review of records and confidential interviews also became more difficult as attention shifted toward responding to the latest threat. At first, there was no obvious reason to connect the bomb threats with the growing investigation into suspicious patient deaths. They appeared to be separate matters requiring different investigative approaches. One involved unexplained medical emergencies, the other involved anonymous criminal communications. Yet as law enforcement examined the bomb threats more closely, investigators reached a conclusion that fundamentally changed the direction of the case. According to the investigation, Kristen Gilbert was responsible for making the false bomb threat calls. Prosecutors argued that these calls were not random acts of disruption, but deliberate attempts to create confusion and divert attention away from the growing scrutiny surrounding the unusual number of patient deaths associated with her work. Whether viewed as an effort to distract investigators or simply to create chaos within the hospital, the bomb threats became significant for two reasons. First, they represented an independent federal crime. Second, they demonstrated, according to prosecutors, that Gilbert was willing to engage in increasingly risky behavior while questions about patient deaths continued to grow. In 1998, Gilbert was convicted for making false bomb threats. Although this conviction was separate from the later murder trial, it intensified the focus on her activities and reinforced investigators' determination to examine every aspect of the suspicious deaths occurring during her employment. The bomb threat case did not prove that she had murdered patients, nor was it presented as direct evidence of homicide. However, it ensured that federal authorities continued examining the broader pattern inside the hospital rather than allowing earlier concerns to fade away. With the investigation gaining momentum, agents from federal agencies, including investigators associated with the Veterans Affairs System and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, expanded their review. Their work was methodical rather than dramatic. There was no single piece of evidence that immediately solved the case. Instead, investigators assembled numerous independent sources of information, each contributing another part of a much larger picture. One of the most important aspects of the investigation involved reviewing medical records in extraordinary detail. Every chart documented the patient's condition, medications administered, nursing observations, physician assessments, and the sequence of events leading to cardiac arrest or death. Investigators searched for similarities across multiple cases, asking whether apparently unrelated emergencies shared common characteristics. They also examined hospital pharmacy records and medication inventories. Because prosecutors believed epinephrine had been used as the alleged murder weapon, understanding how emergency medications were stored, documented, and accessed became essential. The investigation sought to determine whether medication usage corresponded appropriately with documented medical emergencies or whether unexplained discrepancies existed. Another critical component involved reconstructing staff schedules over extended periods. Investigators compared the timing of unexpected cardiac arrests with nursing assignments, identifying which healthcare professionals had been responsible for individual patients before each emergency. Rather than examining isolated incidents, they analyzed patterns extending across months and years. This long-term approach allowed investigators to evaluate whether the repeated association between Gilbert and sudden cardiac arrests could reasonably be explained by coincidence alone. Witness interviews formed another significant pillar of the government's case. Physicians, nurses, pharmacists, administrators, and other hospital employees described their experiences working alongside Gilbert. Some recalled the unusually high number of emergencies during her shifts. Others described concerns that had gradually developed as cardiac arrests became increasingly frequent. Their testimony helped investigators understand not only what happened during individual incidents, but also how the atmosphere inside the hospital changed over time. Among all the witnesses, one individual would become particularly important during the later federal trial, James Perot. By the time investigators interviewed him, his relationship with Gilbert had already become well known. Prosecutors viewed his testimony as especially significant because of his close personal relationship with her during the period when the suspicious deaths occurred. According to the prosecution, Perot told investigators that Gilbert had admitted responsibility for at least one killing during a telephone conversation. This alleged admission became one of the most closely examined pieces of testimony presented during the trial. The defense would later challenge its credibility, while prosecutors argued that it reflected Gilbert's own acknowledgement of her actions. The jury would ultimately evaluate that testimony alongside every other piece of evidence presented. Throughout the proceedings, scientific evidence also played a central role. In several of the investigated deaths, toxicological examination identified the presence of epinephrine under circumstances prosecutors argued were inconsistent with natural medical treatment. Those findings did not stand alone. Instead, they were considered together with patient histories, hospital records, witness testimony, staffing information, and the broader pattern investigators believed they had uncovered. The government never relied upon a single category of evidence. Rather, prosecutors argued that multiple independent lines of investigation pointed toward the same conclusion. Throughout the investigation, authorities remained careful to distinguish proven facts from unresolved suspicions. One issue attracted considerable public attention: the total number of deaths occurring while Gilbert worked at the hospital. During her years at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, approximately 350 patients died. Prosecutors noted that Gilbert had been present during roughly half of those deaths, and statistical experts described such a concentration as extraordinarily unlikely to result from random chance alone. Nevertheless, investigators recognized an essential legal distinction. Statistical improbability does not establish criminal responsibility for individual deaths. Every murder charge required proof beyond a reasonable doubt, supported by evidence specific to that victim. As a result, although many additional deaths remained subjects of discussion and investigation, prosecutors ultimately pursued charges only in cases where they believed the available evidence met the demanding standard required in criminal court. This distinction remains one of the most important aspects of the case. Public speculation has sometimes suggested that Gilbert may have been responsible for far more deaths than those presented at trial. Legally, however, only 4 murders and 2 attempted murders were proven before a jury. The remaining cases were never established as criminal acts in court, and no legal judgment concluded that the total number of victims exceeded those convictions. As federal investigators completed their work, they assembled a case built almost entirely upon the careful integration of many different forms of evidence. There was no surveillance video showing an unlawful injection. No eyewitness claimed to have watched Gilbert secretly administer epinephrine. Instead, the prosecution prepared to demonstrate that hospital records, medication evidence, toxicology findings, witness testimony, staffing schedules, statistical analysis, and Perot's statements formed a consistent and compelling narrative when considered together. The defense, however, prepared to challenge every element of that narrative. They maintained that the patients involved were already gravely ill and that sudden cardiac arrests were an unfortunate but predictable consequence of treating elderly veterans with serious medical conditions. They emphasized the absence of direct eyewitness testimony and argued that much of the government's case depended upon circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof. These competing interpretations would soon be tested before a federal jury. After years of investigation, thousands of pages of medical documentation, countless interviews, and extensive forensic analysis, the case was finally ready for court. What had begun as quiet conversations among concerned nurses inside a veterans' hospital would now unfold publicly in a federal courtroom, where prosecutors and defense attorneys would present sharply different explanations for the same tragic events. The outcome would determine not only Kristen Gilbert's future, but also how one of the most controversial healthcare criminal cases in American history would ultimately be remembered. When the federal murder trial of Kristen Gilbert began in 2000, it represented the culmination of years of investigation. Thousands of hours spent reviewing medical records, extensive forensic analysis, and countless interviews with doctors, nurses, pharmacists, administrators, and investigators. The courtroom would become the place where two fundamentally different interpretations of the same events collided. Prosecutors argued that Gilbert had deliberately transformed a hospital dedicated to healing into the setting for calculated murders. The defense maintained that the government's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, statistical interpretations, and assumptions drawn from the deaths of elderly, medically fragile patients. From the very beginning, everyone involved understood that this would not be a straightforward homicide trial. Unlike many murder cases, there was no crime scene preserved immediately after the deaths. There were no surveillance recordings capturing the alleged acts. No witness testified that they had directly observed Gilbert secretly injecting epinephrine into a patient's intravenous line. The patients at the center of the case had died months or even years earlier, and most had already been buried long before investigators recognized a possible pattern. These realities meant that the prosecution could not rely upon a single dramatic piece of evidence. Instead, federal prosecutors constructed their case by presenting numerous independent categories of evidence that they argued pointed toward the same conclusion. Rather than asking the jury to rely on one witness or one forensic test alone, they invited jurors to examine how multiple pieces of evidence fit together. Medical records formed one of the foundation stones of the government's presentation. Jurors were shown documentation describing the conditions of individual patients before their unexpected cardiac arrests. Prosecutors argued that several of the victims had not appeared to be in immediate danger shortly before their sudden collapse. Although all of the men suffered from significant medical problems, the government maintained that the timing and circumstances surrounding their cardiac arrests were inconsistent with the normal progression of their illnesses. The prosecution carefully reviewed the deaths of the four veterans who ultimately formed the basis of the murder convictions: Stanley Jagodowski, Henry Huden, Kenneth Cutting, and Edward Squira. Each case was presented individually rather than as part of a generalized pattern. Prosecutors explained the patient's medical condition, reconstructed the events leading to the cardiac emergency, and identified Gilbert's involvement during the relevant period. They argued that these cases demonstrated repeated similarities that could not reasonably be dismissed as coincidence. Toxicological evidence also became an important component of the government's case. In particular, prosecutors presented findings indicating the presence of epinephrine in the bodies of some victims under circumstances they argued were inconsistent with routine medical treatment. Because epinephrine is a legitimate emergency medication, its mere presence was not sufficient to establish criminal conduct. Instead, prosecutors argued that the amounts detected, together with the surrounding medical evidence, supported the conclusion that the drug had been administered improperly. Jurors were asked to evaluate these scientific findings alongside the broader sequence of medical events documented in hospital records. Another major area of evidence involved hospital documentation itself. Investigators had spent years reviewing nursing notes, medication records, staffing schedules, and pharmacy inventories. Prosecutors argued that these records revealed recurring patterns linking Gilbert to multiple unexplained cardiac emergencies. They also presented evidence regarding the reported disappearance or unexplained use of epinephrine supplies within the hospital. While none of these records alone proved murder, prosecutors argued that together they strengthened the overall case by demonstrating consistency across numerous independent sources of information. Witness testimony occupied a substantial portion of the trial. Doctors, nurses, and other hospital employees described what they had observed while working alongside Gilbert. Some testified about the unusually high number of code blue emergencies occurring during her shifts. Others explained how concerns gradually developed within the hospital and why several nurses eventually decided to report their observations in 1996. Their testimony illustrated the progression from isolated unease to formal suspicion. Prosecutors emphasized that these concerns did not emerge suddenly after the investigation began. Instead, they argued, experienced healthcare professionals had independently noticed unusual patterns while simply performing their daily responsibilities. Statistical evidence also entered the courtroom, although prosecutors did not suggest that statistics alone could establish guilt. Experts discussed the remarkable concentration of deaths occurring during Gilbert's shifts and explained why they believed such a pattern was extraordinarily unlikely to have occurred by chance. This testimony sought to demonstrate that the repeated association between Gilbert and sudden cardiac arrests deserved careful consideration. At the same time, the jury was reminded that statistical analysis represented only one component of a much larger body of evidence. It was not offered as proof that Gilbert had caused every death occurring during her employment, nor did it substitute for evidence relating to the specific victims named in the indictment. Among the witnesses, one individual attracted particular attention: James Perot, the hospital security officer with whom Gilbert had maintained an extramarital relationship during the period covered by the investigation. Because Perot had been personally close to Gilbert, prosecutors viewed his testimony as highly significant. According to his account, Gilbert had admitted responsibility for at least one killing during a telephone conversation. Prosecutors argued that this statement constituted a powerful indication of guilt when considered, together with the medical evidence and other testimony presented during the trial. The defense challenged Perot's credibility and urged jurors to examine his testimony cautiously. They argued that recollections of private conversations can be influenced by many factors and should not be accepted without careful scrutiny. As with every witness, it was ultimately the jury's responsibility to determine how much weight to assign his testimony. Throughout the proceedings, defense attorneys systematically challenged the government's case. They reminded jurors that every patient involved suffered from serious underlying medical conditions. Elderly veterans with chronic heart disease, diabetes, respiratory illness, and other complex health problems are unfortunately vulnerable to sudden deterioration. According to the defense, unexpected cardiac arrests were tragic, but medically plausible events in such a hospital population. The defense repeatedly emphasized one point above all others: No one had directly witnessed Gilbert administering a fatal injection. There was no eyewitness account describing unauthorized use of epinephrine. There was no video recording. No confession had been recorded. Much of the prosecution's evidence, they argued, was circumstantial. They maintained that investigators had interpreted ordinary medical events through the lens of hindsight after becoming suspicious of one nurse. Defense attorneys also argued that the government's statistical evidence could not establish individual criminal responsibility. Even if Gilbert happened to be present during an unusually high number of emergencies, they argued, unusual patterns sometimes arise naturally in complex medical settings. Coincidence, while uncommon, remains possible. They urged jurors not to confuse improbability with proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The prosecution responded that criminal cases are often proven through the careful accumulation of circumstantial evidence rather than direct observation. They argued that the law does not require eyewitness testimony if the totality of evidence establishes guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. According to prosecutors, the combination of toxicological findings, patient histories, hospital records, staffing schedules, witness testimony, statistical analysis, and Perot's account created a coherent explanation that could not reasonably be attributed to coincidence or natural disease alone. After months of testimony, document review, expert analysis, and legal argument, the responsibility shifted entirely to the jury. Jurors were instructed to evaluate each charge independently, considering only the evidence presented in court and applying the legal standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They were not asked to determine whether Gilbert might have been responsible for every suspicious death at the hospital. Instead, they focused on the specific murder and attempted murder charges contained in the federal indictment. On March 14, 2001, the jury returned its verdict. Kristen Gilbert was found guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that the prosecution had met its burden of proof regarding the specific victims presented during the trial. Although prosecutors had introduced evidence suggesting broader concerns involving numerous additional deaths, the convictions related only to the 4 murders and 2 attempted murders that had been proven in court beyond a reasonable doubt. Because the crimes occurred at a federal Veterans Affairs hospital, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. This created an unusual legal circumstance. Massachusetts itself did not impose the death penalty, but federal law permitted prosecutors to seek capital punishment because the offenses occurred on federal property. As the sentencing phase approached, the possibility of a death sentence became one of the most closely watched aspects of the case. Ultimately, however, the jury recommended against imposing the death penalty. Instead, they chose life imprisonment. That decision concluded one of the most significant healthcare murder trials in American history. But the legal proceedings were not yet entirely complete. Formal sentencing would soon determine exactly how the federal court intended to ensure that Kristen Gilbert would never again occupy a position of trust over vulnerable patients. The judgment that followed would permanently close the chapter on her nursing career while leaving lasting questions about how many lives may have been affected before the pattern inside the Veterans Affairs Medical Center was finally recognized. The conviction of Kristen Gilbert in March 2001 marked the end of a long and complex legal battle, but it did not bring complete closure to everyone affected by the case. For the families of the 4 veterans whose deaths formed the foundation of the prosecution, the verdict represented a formal acknowledgement that their loved ones had not simply died from illness. The jury had determined that those deaths were the result of criminal actions. Yet even after the conviction, the case continued to raise difficult questions that extended beyond the courtroom. How could such a pattern have continued inside a hospital for so long? Were there other victims whose deaths were never fully explained? And could earlier recognition of the warning signs have prevented further tragedies? These questions would remain connected to the Kristen Gilbert case long after the trial ended. After the jury found Gilbert guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of second-degree murder, and 2 counts of attempted murder, the court moved into the sentencing phase. Because the crimes occurred at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, a federal facility, the case fell under federal jurisdiction. This created a unique legal situation because federal law allowed prosecutors to seek the death penalty even though Massachusetts, where the hospital was located, did not use capital punishment. The possibility of a death sentence became one of the most closely watched elements of the case. Prosecutors had argued that the seriousness of the crimes justified the harshest possible punishment. Their position was based on the extraordinary level of trust involved in the case. Gilbert had not been accused of attacking strangers or committing violence in a public place. Instead, prosecutors argued that she had violated the fundamental responsibility of a healthcare professional by harming people who depended on her for protection and care. The victims were vulnerable patients. They were elderly veterans receiving treatment in a hospital environment where they had every reason to believe they were safe. According to the prosecution, the betrayal of that trust represented one of the most disturbing aspects of the crimes. The defense, however, continued challenging the government's interpretation of events. Even after the guilty verdict, they maintained that the evidence had been insufficient and that Gilbert should not receive the maximum punishment. They continued emphasizing that the case had been built largely through circumstantial evidence, rather than direct observation. The defense argued that medical uncertainty and the serious health conditions of the patients created reasonable questions about the conclusions reached by investigators. During sentencing deliberations, the jury ultimately decided not to recommend the death penalty. Instead, they chose a sentence of life imprisonment. On March 27, 2001, Kristen Gilbert received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 20 years in prison for the attempted murder convictions. The sentence ensured that she would remain incarcerated for the rest of her life. It also reflected the seriousness with which the justice system viewed the crimes for which she had been convicted. The conclusion of the trial brought legal accountability, but it did not eliminate the uncertainty surrounding the full scope of the case. One of the most controversial aspects of the investigation involved the number of possible victims. During Gilbert's years working at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, approximately 350 patients died at the hospital. Prosecutors highlighted the fact that Gilbert was present during roughly half of those deaths. Statistical experts testified that such a concentration was extraordinarily unlikely to have occurred randomly. These findings contributed to the prosecution's argument that the 4 proven murders might represent only a portion of a larger pattern. However, the distinction between suspicion and proof remained essential. The criminal justice system requires evidence strong enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. While investigators identified many deaths that raised questions, they did not possess sufficient evidence to charge Gilbert with additional murders. The legal record therefore recognizes 4 confirmed murder victims, not hundreds. Any suggestion of a larger number of victims remains a matter of speculation and investigative concern rather than a proven fact. This uncertainty became one of the most haunting elements of the case. Families who had lost loved ones at the hospital were left wondering whether their relatives' deaths might have involved circumstances that were never discovered. At the same time, investigators had to acknowledge the limitations of available evidence. Many patients had died naturally from serious illnesses. Medical conditions that made the crimes difficult to detect also made retrospective investigations extremely challenging. By the time concerns emerged, some patients had already been buried, records were incomplete, and the opportunity for certain types of forensic examination had passed. The case also prompted broader discussions about patient safety and oversight within healthcare. Institution. Hospitals depend upon trust. Patients and families assume that medical professionals are working to preserve life, not threaten it. that trust is essential for healthcare systems to function. When a medical professional is accused of violating that trust, the impact extends beyond individual victims. It affects coworkers, institutions, and public confidence in healthcare as a whole. The Kristen Gilbert case became one of the most widely discussed examples of the dangers that can occur when someone in a position of authority allegedly exploits access to vulnerable individuals. Another significant aspect of the case was the role played by coworkers who eventually reported their concerns. The three nurses who noticed the unusual pattern faced an extremely difficult decision. They had to balance loyalty to a colleague with their responsibility to protect patients. Their actions demonstrated the importance of speaking up when professional observations suggest a potential threat. Without their willingness to document concerns and report what they had observed, the investigation might never have progressed. Their role became an important reminder that patient safety depends not only on medical knowledge, but also on the courage to question unusual circumstances. For Kristen Gilbert herself, the conviction permanently ended the career that had once provided her with respect, responsibility, and access to vulnerable patients. The identity she had built as a nurse was replaced by her identity as a convicted murderer. The contrast between those two images became one of the reasons the case attracted such widespread attention. To many observers, the most disturbing question was not only how the crimes could have occurred, but how someone entrusted with saving lives could allegedly become responsible for taking them. Over time, the nickname associated with Gilbert, the Angel of Death, became widely used in discussions of the case. However, behind that label were real people whose lives were permanently changed. The veterans who died were not simply names in a legal proceeding. They were individuals with personal histories, families, and experiences that extended far beyond the circumstances of their deaths. They had served their country, entered a healthcare system expecting treatment and support, and became victims in a case that would later attract national attention. Remembering the victims remains essential because the focus of true crime stories can sometimes shift toward the offender. Yet the central reality of this case is the harm experienced by those patients and their families. The investigation, the trial, and the conviction were ultimately about accountability for those lives lost. The years following Gilbert's sentencing did not erase the unanswered questions surrounding the Veterans Affairs Medical Center. The confirmed facts established that she was responsible for 4 murders and 2 attempted murders. They established that she had been convicted through a federal trial based on a combination of medical evidence, witness testimony, investigative findings, and statistical analysis. But beyond those proven cases remained uncertainty. The possibility of additional victims continued to be discussed because of the unusual number of deaths associated with her presence at the hospital. Still, without sufficient evidence, those possibilities could never become confirmed crimes in the eyes of the law. The Kristen Gilbert case, therefore, remains a complicated example of both the strengths and limitations of criminal investigation. It demonstrated how patterns can eventually reveal hidden wrongdoing, even when individual events appear ordinary. It also showed the difficulty of investigating crimes that occur within healthcare settings, where natural death and deliberate harm can sometimes appear dangerously similar. Years after the trial ended, the case continues to be studied because it represents one of the most serious breaches of medical trust in American history. It is remembered not only because of the crimes for which Kristen Gilbert was convicted, but also because of the questions that remain about detection, accountability, and the responsibility of protecting those who are most vulnerable. The conviction of Kristen Gilbert brought a legal conclusion to one of the most disturbing criminal cases connected to an American hospital. But the impact of the case continued long after the courtroom proceedings ended. Unlike many criminal investigations where the truth becomes clearer after a verdict, the Gilbert case remained surrounded by difficult questions. The jury had determined that she was responsible for 4 murders and 2 attempted murders. The evidence presented at trial had convinced them beyond a reasonable doubt. Yet outside those proven cases remained uncertainty, particularly regarding the possibility that other deaths might have been connected to her actions. That uncertainty became one of the defining characteristics of the case. The story of Kristen Gilbert was not only about what was proven. It was also about the challenges investigators faced when trying to uncover wrongdoing in a place where death was already an expected part of daily life. Hospitals exist at the boundary between life and death. Every day, medical professionals treat patients whose conditions can change suddenly. Even with advanced medicine, some patients will die despite receiving appropriate care. This reality creates a difficult environment for detecting intentional harm. When a patient dies from a heart condition, respiratory failure, cancer, or another serious illness, the death may appear completely natural. In the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, many of the patients were elderly veterans living with multiple health problems. Their deaths did not immediately appear unusual because illness and mortality were already common parts of the hospital environment. This was one of the reasons prosecutors argued that the alleged crimes were difficult to identify. According to their theory, the person responsible had chosen victims and circumstances where suspicious events could easily be mistaken for natural medical outcomes. The alleged method relied not on obvious violence, but on exploiting the routines and expectations of a healthcare environment. A medication normally associated with saving lives became central to the prosecution's explanation of how the crimes were committed. Emergency procedures that existed to protect patients became, according to prosecutors, the setting in which the alleged deception occurred. The very systems designed to respond to danger also made the events appear legitimate. When a code blue was announced, medical professionals did exactly what they were trained to do. They rushed to help. They performed resuscitation. They attempted to save a patient's life. The presence of Kristen Gilbert during those emergencies initially strengthened her reputation. Rather than creating suspicion, she appeared to be the nurse who remained calm during moments of crisis. She appeared to be someone who could be trusted when patients were at their most vulnerable. This contrast between appearance and accusation became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The investigation also highlighted the importance of recognizing patterns. No single event immediately revealed a crime. There was no single moment when everyone inside the hospital suddenly understood what was happening. Instead, awareness developed gradually through repeated observations. 3 nurses noticed that something appeared unusual. They compared their experiences. They documented concerns. They reported what they had seen. Their actions demonstrated a critical principle in any organization responsible for public safety. Patterns often become visible first to those closest to the situation. The nurses were not investigators. They were healthcare professionals doing their jobs. Their concerns came from repeated exposure to the realities of patient care. They understood that unusual events happen in medicine, but they also understood when a pattern seemed inconsistent with ordinary experience. Their decision to report their concerns became a turning point in the case. Without those reports, investigators might never have examined the hospital's records in the same way. The case also raised broader questions about oversight within medical institutions. Hospitals depend on internal systems for monitoring medication use, documenting patient care, and responding to unusual outcomes. In most cases, these systems function effectively. However, the Gilbert case demonstrated how difficult it can be to detect intentional wrongdoing when someone understands those systems and works within them. Medical professionals are granted significant responsibility because patients depend upon their expertise. That responsibility also creates opportunities for abuse if a person chooses to violate professional standards. The case therefore became a reminder that trust, while essential in healthcare, must exist alongside accountability and careful oversight. Another lasting aspect of the case involved the debate over the possible number of victims. Public attention often focused on the possibility that Gilbert may have been responsible for many more deaths than those proven at trial. prosecutors introduced statistical evidence showing that she had been present during a large number of patient deaths during her employment. Experts testified that this concentration was highly unusual. However, unusual patterns alone could not establish criminal responsibility for every death. The justice system requires specific evidence connected to specific victims. This distinction is important because the difference between suspicion and proof is central to criminal justice. The investigation raised serious concerns, but concerns are not the same as convictions. The only legally established victims remain the 4 veterans whose deaths resulted in murder convictions and the 2 patients involved in attempted murder charges. The unresolved questions surrounding additional deaths also affected families of other patients who died during the same period. For families who lost loved ones at the hospital, uncertainty could be deeply painful. A natural death may provide one type of closure, even when it is heartbreaking. The possibility that a loved one's death may have involved deliberate harm creates a different kind of grief. However, without sufficient evidence, investigators could not provide definitive answers for every family. This limitation illustrates one of the hardest realities of criminal investigations. Sometimes the truth may be suspected, but impossible to prove in court. The case also changed how many people viewed crimes committed by healthcare workers. Historically, medical professionals are associated with healing and compassion. Society places enormous trust in doctors, nurses, and caregivers because patients often depend on them when they are unable to protect themselves. When that trust is violated, the emotional impact is particularly severe. The fear created by cases like Gilbert's comes not only from the crimes themselves, but from the realization that harm can come from someone who appears to represent safety. However, it is also important to recognize that the actions of one individual do not represent the millions of healthcare workers who dedicate their lives to caring for others. The Gilbert case became infamous precisely because it was such a profound violation of the values that define medical care. It was an exception, not a reflection of the healthcare profession as a whole. The case also demonstrated the complexity of proving crimes involving medical knowledge. Unlike many criminal investigations where physical evidence clearly identifies a suspect, medical cases often require interpretation of records, expert analysis, and reconstruction of events that occurred in private settings. The prosecution's success depended on connecting many separate pieces of information into a coherent explanation. Medical evidence, witness testimony, statistical analysis, and documentation all played roles in establishing guilt. The defense, meanwhile, reminded the jury that alternative explanations existed and that serious illnesses could produce unpredictable outcomes. The trial therefore became a debate over how much evidence is enough when direct proof is unavailable. Ultimately, the jury concluded that the evidence met the required legal standard for the specific charges presented. Kristen Gilbert's name remains associated with one of the most infamous healthcare criminal cases in American history. Yet the lasting significance of the case extends beyond the individual offender. It serves as an example of how unusual patterns can eventually be recognized, how professional responsibility includes the courage to report concerns, and how difficult it can be to uncover crimes hidden within ordinary systems. The story also remains a reminder that behind every investigation are real people whose lives were affected. The veterans who died were not simply evidence in a trial. They were patients who entered a hospital expecting care and protection. Their families experienced loss that no verdict could fully reverse. The purpose of examining cases like this is not only to understand the actions of the person convicted, but also to remember those who suffered because of them. Today, the Kristen Gilbert case remains unresolved in one important sense. The legal questions have been answered. A jury found her guilty. A federal court sentenced her to spend the rest of her life in prison. But the broader questions about how many lives may have been affected and whether warning signs could have been recognized earlier continue to generate discussion. The case stands as one of the clearest examples of the dangers that arise when trust is exploited, and when unusual patterns are overlooked for too long. It remains a story about crime, investigation, and justice, but above all, it remains a story about vulnerable patients whose lives deserve protection.